The marigold garlands hung heavy in the morning light, their orange petals catching dust motes that danced above the wooden pews. I smoothed my navy coat and stepped into the wedding hall, my heels clicking against marble that had been polished to mirror brightness. The scent of jasmine and roses filled the air, mingling with the nervous energy of guests finding their seats. I moved toward the front row, where mothers traditionally sit. Where I had always imagined I would sit on this day. The chair waited, draped in cream silk with a small bouquet of baby's breath tied to its back. My daughter's wedding. My place. Don't sit here. The words came sharp and low, meant only for my ears. Sarah stood beside me in her ivory gown, her veil cascading like water down her back. But her face held no bridal glow, only the cold fury I had come to know so well these past months. "You don't deserve a seat at my wedding," she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper but cutting through the organ's gentle prelude like a blade. "Find somewhere else." The guests behind us continued their quiet chatter, adjusting programs and checking phones. They hadn't heard. But I felt their eyes beginning to turn our way, sensing the tension that crackled between mother and daughter like electricity before a storm. I looked at my daughter, this woman I had carried, nursed, raised, loved through scraped knees and broken hearts and midnight fevers. This woman, who now stood before me in a dress I had helped pay for, in a ceremony I had helped plan, was telling me I didn't deserve to witness her joy. The wooden chair creaked slightly as I lowered myself into it, my hands folding calmly in my lap. The marigold garland above us swayed, a few petals drifting down to land on my shoulder like golden tears. "I'm sitting here," I said quietly, my voice steady as stone. "This is where I belong." Sarah's face flushed red beneath her carefully applied makeup. Her bouquet trembled in her grip, white roses and eucalyptus that I had suggested during one of our last civil conversations. Before everything changed. Before the fractures became chasms. She opened her mouth to speak again, but the organ swelled louder, signaling the ceremony's beginning. The officiant raised his hands, and guests rose to their feet. Sarah had no choice but to take her place at the altar, leaving me in the front row where I had claimed my ground. I sat with my spine straight, my breathing even, my eyes fixed on the altar where my daughter would soon promise to love and honor another human being. The irony wasn't lost on me. But I had learned, in these past 30 days, that dignity doesn't require permission. The story of how I came to sit in that chair, how I came to claim my place despite being told I didn't deserve it, begins 30 days earlier. 30 days that would reshape everything I thought I knew about love, respect, and the quiet power that lives in a woman who finally decides she's had enough. Within those 30 days, locks would be changed. Papers would be signed. Suitcases would be packed. A daughter would learn that her mother's love didn't mean her mother's submission. And I would discover that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. This is the story of what gets rebuilt when everything falls apart. Not destroyed, rebuilt. There's a difference, and it matters more than you might think. But first, let me take you back to where the hairline fractures began. 3 weeks before the wedding, I stood in my kitchen making tea, the kettle's whistle cutting through the afternoon quiet. Rain tapped against the window in a rhythm that matched my restless thoughts. The phone call with Sarah had ended abruptly 20 minutes ago, her voice sharp with irritation when I'd asked about the rehearsal dinner seating chart. "I'll handle it, Mom. You don't need to worry about every detail." The line had gone dead before I could respond. No goodbye. No acknowledgement that I had offered to help, not interfere. Just the dial tone humming in my ear like a judgment. I poured the steaming water over chamomile leaves and watched them unfurl in the clear glass mug. Such a simple thing, tea. Such a reliable comfort. The leaves knew their purpose, to steep, to release their essence, to provide warmth. They didn't question whether they deserved to be in the cup. The wedding planning had been like this for months. Small exclusions that felt like paper cuts. Conversations that ended when I entered the room. Decisions made without consulting me were then presented as fait accompli. When I'd asked about helping with the flowers, Sarah had already booked a florist. When I'd offered to host the bridal shower, she'd already chosen her future mother-in-law's house. When I'd suggested we shop for her something blue together, she'd already bought it online. Each rejection was reasonable on its own. Explainable. Defensible. But together, they formed a pattern that spelled out a truth I was only beginning to understand. I was being erased from my daughter's life one small exclusion at a time. I carried my tea to the living room and sat in the chair by the window, watching rain streak down the glass. The house felt too quiet, too empty. It had been my sanctuary for 15 years, since the divorce. The place where I'd rebuilt my life, where Sarah had come for Sunday dinners and holiday mornings. Where we'd planned her college applications and celebrated her first job and toasted her engagement. Now it felt like a museum of a relationship that no longer existed. My phone buzzed with a text from my friend Margaret. "How's the wedding planning going? You must be so excited." I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "It's complicated." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Margaret was choosing her words carefully. Finally, "Want to talk about it?" I did want to talk about it. But what would I say? That my daughter had stopped including me in her wedding plans? That she spoke to me like I was an inconvenience rather than her mother? I felt like I was watching my own child slip away from me, and I didn't know how to stop it. Instead, I typed, "Maybe later. Thanks for asking." The rain continued its steady percussion against the window. I made a mental list of all the things I had done wrong, all the ways I might have failed as a mother. The list grew longer as the afternoon wore on, each item a small stone added to the weight in my chest. But then, as the light began to fade, I found myself making a different kind of list. Not of my failures, but of my truths. Things I no longer owe anyone. An apology for taking up space. Gratitude for being tolerated. Silence when I'm being dismissed. Acceptance of disrespect disguised as independence. Permission to exist in my own life. I wrote these words on a piece of paper, my handwriting steady despite the tremor in my hands. The act of writing them felt dangerous and necessary, like lancing a wound that had been festering too long. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. The window glass cleared enough for me to see my reflection, a woman of 62 with silver-streaked hair and tired eyes, but with something new flickering in her expression. Something that looked like the beginning of a resolution. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. The weight of it felt significant, like carrying a small revolution close to my heart. The phone rang again. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But old habits die hard, and I answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom, I need you to pick up my dress from the alterations shop tomorrow. The final fitting is done." No greeting. No please. Just an instruction delivered with the expectation of compliance. "I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow afternoon," I said. "Could you pick it up yourself, or could we arrange another time?" A pause. Then, "Seriously? It's one errand, Mom. Can't you reschedule?" The paper in my pocket seemed to pulse with warmth. Silence is not agreement, I thought. No, I can't reschedule. My health appointments are important too. Another pause, longer this time. Fine. I'll figure it out myself. I always do. The line went dead again. But this time, instead of the familiar ache of rejection, I felt something else. Something that might have been relief. I made another cup of tea and returned to my chair by the window. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. In the distance, I could see the lights of other houses beginning to flicker on, other families settling into their evening routines. I thought about the woman I had been at Sarah's age, eager to please, quick to apologize, always making myself smaller to avoid conflict. I thought about the woman I had become after the divorce, stronger, more independent, but still carrying the old patterns like invisible chains. And I thought about the woman I might become if I finally learned to say no. If I stopped apologizing for existing. If I claimed my place at the table instead of waiting to be invited. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that jumping might mean flying or falling, but that staying put meant slowly turning to stone. I pulled out the paper and read my list again. Then I added one more line. The obligation to shrink myself to fit other people's comfort zones. The words looked bold on the page, bolder than I felt. But sometimes courage begins with the simple act of writing down what you're no longer willing to accept. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. I sat in my chair, sipping tea and watching the world settle into darkness, feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates finding a new alignment. Change was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the way the light fell differently across my living room, in the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Change was coming, and for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready. The next morning, Margaret brought me a thermos of coffee and the kind of determined expression that meant she wasn't leaving until we talked. She settled into my kitchen like she belonged there, which she did after 20 years of friendship, and fixed me with the look that had made her an excellent high school principal before retirement. "Spill," she said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "And don't tell me it's nothing. I've known you too long." So I told her. About the phone calls that ended abruptly. About being excluded from wedding decisions. About feeling like I was being systematically erased from my daughter's life. Margaret listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her gray eyes steady and kind. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Steam rose from our cups, carrying the rich scent of dark roast and the promise of clarity that comes with good coffee and better friends. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked finally. The question hung in the air between us. Not what should you do or what would I do, but what was I going to do? The assumption of agency, of choice, of power I hadn't realized I still possessed. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to just endure it. Keep the peace. Hope things get better after the wedding." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And the other part?" I thought about the list in my pocket, about the words I'd written in the fading light. "The other part wants to stop accepting unacceptable behavior. Even from my daughter. Especially from my daughter." "Tell me about that part." So I did. I told her about changing the locks, about updating my will, about the small acts of independence I'd been considering. About reclaiming my space, my time, my right to be treated with basic respect. Margaret nodded as I spoke, her expression growing more approving with each word. "You know what this sounds like?" she said when I finished. "What?" "It sounds like you're finally growing up." I laughed despite myself. "I'm 62 years old, Margaret. I think I'm past the growing up stage." "Are you?" "Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been stuck in the same pattern for decades. Trying to earn love through service. Accepting crumbs and calling them a feast. Making yourself smaller so other people can feel bigger." Her words stung because they were true. I had been doing exactly that, not just with Sarah but in most of my relationships. The habit was so ingrained I barely noticed it anymore. "So what do I do?" I asked. Margaret leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You start treating yourself like someone who matters. You set boundaries and enforce them. You stop asking for permission to exist in your own life." "But what if she cuts me off completely? What if I lose her?" "Honey," Margaret said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, "what exactly do you think you have to lose? A relationship where you're constantly walking on eggshells? A daughter who treats you like an inconvenience? That's not a relationship, that's a hostage situation." The truth of her words hit me like cold water. I had been so afraid of losing Sarah that I'd already lost myself. I'd been so focused on keeping the peace that I'd forgotten peace without dignity isn't peace at all, it's surrender. Repair begins in private, Margaret said, releasing my hand. Before you can fix anything with Sarah, you need to fix things with yourself. You need to remember who you are when you're not trying to be who everyone else wants you to be. After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about her words. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny possibilities. I thought about the woman I'd been before marriage, before motherhood, before I'd learned to make myself small. She felt like a stranger now, but maybe it wasn't too late to reintroduce myself. I pulled out a legal pad and began making lists. Not of my failures this time, but of my options. Practical steps I could take to reclaim my autonomy. Financial moves to secure my independence. Legal protections to ensure my wishes were respected. The act of writing felt powerful, like drawing a map to a country I'd forgotten existed. A country where I was the sovereign, where my needs mattered, where respect wasn't something I had to earn but something I deserved simply by virtue of being human. By evening, I had filled 3 pages with plans and possibilities. Some were small, changing my phone number, updating my emergency contacts. Others were larger, consulting with an attorney about my estate planning, researching senior living communities that offered independence without isolation. All of them shared one common thread: they were about me taking control of my own life instead of waiting for someone else to permit me to live it. I made dinner for one and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. I watched the news without apologizing to anyone for my choice of channel. I took a long bath with lavender oil and didn't hurry to answer when the phone rang. It was Sarah, of course. Her voice was tight with frustration when I finally called her back. I'd been trying to reach you for an hour. Where were you? Taking a bath, I said simply. Well, I need to talk to you about the rehearsal dinner. There's been a change in plans. I waited for her to continue, but she seemed to expect me to ask for details. When I didn't, she sighed dramatically. The restaurant had to move us to a smaller room, so we're cutting the guest list. I'm sorry, but we can't include you. The words should have hurt. A month ago, they would have devastated me. But sitting in my kitchen with my list spread before me, I felt something different. Not pain, but clarity. I see, I said. Another pause. Sarah had clearly expected tears, protests, and pleas for reconsideration. My calm acceptance seemed to unnerve her. It's nothing personal, Mom. It's just logistics. Of course, I said. Thank you for letting me know. That's it? You're not going to argue? I looked at my lists, at the plans I'd made for reclaiming my life. No, Sarah. I'm not going to argue. You've made your decision, and I respect it. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we weren't saying. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice smaller now, uncertain. Okay. Well, I guess I'll talk to you later. I'm sure you will, I said, and meant it. But the terms of those future conversations would be different. I would make sure of that. After I hung up, I added one more item to my list: stop accepting invitations to my own diminishment. The words looked strong on the page, stronger than I felt. But strength, I was learning, wasn't about feeling powerful. It was about acting with dignity even when your hands were shaking. It was about choosing self-respect over self-sacrifice, even when the choice felt impossible. I folded my lists and put them in the drawer with my important papers. Tomorrow, I will begin the work of implementing them. Tonight, I would sit with the quiet satisfaction of having finally chosen myself. Outside, the world continued its ancient rhythms. But inside my kitchen, something new was being born. Something that looked like hope and felt like coming home to myself after a very long journey. The locksmith arrived at 8 in the morning, a cheerful woman named Rosa, who didn't ask questions about why I wanted all the locks changed. She simply nodded when I explained that I needed new keys and set to work with the efficiency of someone who understood that sometimes a fresh start begins with a new set of keys. I watched her work, the sound of drilling and metal against metal creating a rhythm that felt like progress. Each old lock removed was a small liberation, each new one installed a quiet declaration of independence. Rosa hummed while she worked, a Spanish lullaby that filled the house with unexpected warmth. "You want me to make extra copies?" she asked, holding up the shiny new keys. "Just one set for me," I said. "That's all I need." She nodded approvingly. "Sometimes less is more, see?" After she left, I walked through my house with the new keys warm in my palm. The weight of them felt significant, like holding the physical manifestation of choice. I tested each lock, the smooth click of tumblers falling into place sounding like small victories. In Sarah's old bedroom, I stood in the doorway looking at the remnants of her childhood. Posters of boy bands she'd outgrown, books she'd loved and abandoned, a jewelry box that played a tinny version of Fur Elise when opened. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, settling on memories that belonged to a different version of both of us. I began to pack her things carefully, not with anger but with the gentle finality of someone closing a chapter. Each item went into boxes labeled with her name and address. Her high school yearbooks, the ceramic horse collection she'd been obsessed with at 12, the prom dress she'd insisted on keeping just in case. All of it is preserved, but no longer takes up space in my daily life. The closet revealed clothes she'd left behind over the years, sweaters she'd outgrown, jeans with holes she'd called distressed, a winter coat she'd abandoned when she moved to her apartment. I folded each piece with care, remembering the girl who had worn them, honoring that memory while acknowledging that girl no longer lived here. By evening, the room was empty except for the furniture. Clean surfaces reflected the lamplight, and the space felt ready for whatever came next. Maybe a home office. Maybe a reading room. Maybe just space that belonged entirely to me. I made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, the new keys beside my plate like a promise. The house felt different already, not smaller without Sarah's things, but more honest. More like a place where I lived rather than a shrine to who I used to be. The phone rang during dessert. Sarah's name on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail while I finished my tea. When I finally listened to the message, her voice was tight with confusion and something that might have been concern. "Mom, I stopped by to pick up my blue sweater, but my key doesn't work. Did you change the locks? Call me back." I deleted the message and made another cup of tea. Tomorrow, I will call her back. Tonight, I would sit in my reclaimed space and feel what it was like to be home in my own life. The next morning brought a stack of boxes to Sarah's doorstep and a note written in my careful handwriting, "Your belongings, packed with love. The locks have been changed for security reasons. Please call before visiting. Love, Mom." I didn't wait to see her reaction. I had errands to run, a life to rebuild, and no time to manage other people's emotions about my choices. The locksmith arrived at 8 in the morning, a cheerful woman named Rosa, who didn't ask questions about why I wanted all the locks changed. She simply nodded when I explained that I needed new keys and set to work with the efficiency of someone who understood that sometimes a fresh start begins with a new set of keys. I watched her work, the sound of drilling and metal against metal creating a rhythm that felt like progress. Each old lock removed was a small liberation, each new one installed a quiet declaration of independence. Rosa hummed while she worked, a Spanish lullaby that filled the house with unexpected warmth. "You want me to make extra copies?" she asked, holding up the shiny new keys. "Just one set for me," I said. "That's all I need." She nodded approvingly. "Sometimes less is more, see?" After she left, I walked through my house with the new keys warm in my palm. The weight of them felt significant, like holding the physical manifestation of choice. I tested each lock, the smooth click of tumblers falling into place sounding like small victories. In Sarah's old bedroom, I stood in the doorway looking at the remnants of her childhood. Posters of boy bands she'd outgrown, books she'd loved and abandoned, a jewelry box that played a tinny version of Fur Elise when opened. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, settling on memories that belonged to a different version of both of us. I began to pack her things carefully, not with anger but with the gentle finality of someone closing a chapter. Each item went into boxes labeled with her name and address. Her high school yearbooks, the ceramic horse collection she'd been obsessed with at 12, the prom dress she'd insisted on keeping just in case. All of it is preserved, but no longer takes up space in my daily life. The closet revealed clothes she'd left behind over the years, sweaters she'd outgrown, jeans with holes she'd called distressed, a winter coat she'd abandoned when she moved to her apartment. I folded each piece with care, remembering the girl who had worn them, honoring that memory while acknowledging that girl no longer lived here. By evening, the room was empty except for the furniture. Clean surfaces reflected the lamplight, and the space felt ready for whatever came next. Maybe a home office. Maybe a reading room. Maybe just space that belonged entirely to me. I made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, the new keys beside my plate like a promise. The house felt different already, not smaller without Sarah's things, but more honest. More like a place where I lived rather than a shrine to who I used to be. The phone rang during dessert. Sarah's name on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail while I finished my tea. When I finally listened to the message, her voice was tight with confusion and something that might have been concern. Mom, I stopped by to pick up my blue sweater, but my key doesn't work. Did you change the locks? Call me back. I deleted the message and made another cup of tea. Tomorrow, I will call her back. Tonight, I would sit in my reclaimed space and feel what it was like to be home in my own life. The next morning brought a stack of boxes to Sarah's doorstep and a note written in my careful handwriting, "Your belongings, packed with love." The locks had been changed for security reasons. Please call before visiting. Love, Mom. I didn't wait to see her reaction. I had errands to run, a life to rebuild, and no time to manage other people's emotions about my choices. The bank smelled like fresh coffee and quiet efficiency. I sat across from Janet, the estate planning specialist, with a folder of documents spread between us like a roadmap to my future. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating papers that would reshape the landscape of my life. So you want to establish a revocable trust, Janet said, her pen poised over the forms. And remove your daughter as the power of attorney. That's correct. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled slightly as I signed each document. I want to maintain control of my own affairs. Janet nodded without judgment. She'd seen this before, families fractured by expectations and disappointments, parents reclaiming autonomy from adult children who'd forgotten that love and control weren't the same thing. The trust will protect your assets and ensure your wishes are followed, she explained. You can always modify it later if circumstances change. If circumstances change. The phrase hung in the air like a question mark. Would Sarah and I find our way back to each other? Would she learn to treat me with the respect I was finally demanding? Or would this be the beginning of a permanent separation? I didn't know the answers, but I knew I couldn't continue living in the limbo of hoping for change while accepting the unacceptable. Sometimes love means setting boundaries, even when those boundaries feel like walls. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out a sealed envelope. I want to update my beneficiaries. Janet took the envelope without comment, but I saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. This wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. About refusing to reward disrespect with inheritance. About teaching a lesson that might be the most loving thing I could do, even if it didn't feel loving in the moment. The paperwork took 2 hours to complete. Each signature felt like a small revolution, each initial a quiet declaration of independence. When we finished, Janet handed me copies of everything in a neat manila folder. Your affairs are in order, she said. You should feel proud of taking control of your future. Proud. The word felt foreign but not unwelcome. When was the last time I'd felt proud of myself? When was the last time I'd done something for my own benefit without apologizing for it? I walked out of the bank with my folder tucked under my arm and my new keys jingling in my pocket. The afternoon was crisp and bright, full of possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just enduring. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, "We need to talk." This is ridiculous. I read the message twice, then put my phone away without responding. She was right, we did need to talk. But it would be on my terms now, when I was ready, not when she demanded it. The days of jumping at her every summons were over. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods I'd lived in for decades but rarely really seen. Tree-lined streets where other women my age walked dogs and tended gardens and lived lives that belonged entirely to them. I envied their apparent peace, their settled contentment, but I no longer felt like it was beyond my reach. At home, I put the folder in my desk drawer next to the lists I'd made. Documents and dreams, plans and possibilities, all filed away like seeds waiting for the right season to grow. The house felt different now, not just because of the new locks or the empty bedroom, but because of the energy that filled it. The energy of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. Who had finally learned that her worth wasn't a shared account, subject to other people's withdrawals and deposits. I made dinner and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. I watched the sunset paint my kitchen walls golden orange, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Contentment that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Sarah would demand explanations I might not be ready to give. Friends would ask questions I might not know how to answer. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own life, on my own terms, with my own keys in my own pocket. The feeling was intoxicating and terrifying and necessary. Like learning to breathe underwater, or discovering you could fly. They came at dusk, when the sky was painted in shades of anger and the air crackled with the electricity of an approaching storm. I saw them through my kitchen window, Sarah and her fiancé David, their faces set with the kind of righteous fury that comes from having your expectations challenged. The doorbell rang once, then again more insistently. When I didn't answer immediately, Sarah began pounding on the door with her fist, the sound echoing through my house like accusations. "Mom. Open this door right now. We know you're in there." I took my time walking to the front door, my new keys heavy in my pocket. Through the peephole, I could see them both, Sarah in her designer jeans and cashmere sweater, David in his expensive suit, both of them radiating the kind of entitlement that comes from never having been told no. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. The chain lock remained engaged, creating a barrier that was both physical and symbolic. "Hello, Sarah." "David." My voice was calm, though my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Sarah's face was flushed with anger, her carefully applied makeup slightly smudged. "Changing the locks? Cutting me out of your accounts? Have you lost your mind?" "I've found it, actually," I said. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd lower your voice. The neighbors don't need to hear this conversation." David stepped forward, his jaw tight with barely controlled rage. "Mrs. Patterson, this is completely unacceptable. Sarah is your daughter. She has a right to—" "She has a right to nothing," I interrupted, my voice still steady but with steel underneath. "She's an adult with her own life and her own resources. My financial affairs are my own business." "But what if something happens to you?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly, and for a moment I glimpsed the little girl she used to be, the one who crawled into my bed during thunderstorms and believed I could fix anything. "What if you get sick? What if you need help?" "Then I'll handle it like the competent adult I've been for 62 years, I said. "I don't need a guardian, Sarah. I need a daughter who treats me with respect." The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. Respect. Such a simple concept, yet apparently so difficult to grasp. "This is about the rehearsal dinner, isn't it?" David said, his voice dripping with condescension. You're throwing a tantrum because you didn't get invited to one party. The dismissal in his tone, the casual reduction of months of accumulated slights to a tantrum, sparked something dangerous in my chest. But I kept my voice level, my expression calm. This isn't about one party, David. This is about a pattern of behavior that I'm no longer willing to accept. What pattern? Sarah demanded. I've been planning a wedding. I've been stressed and busy, and maybe I haven't been perfect, but that doesn't give you the right to. To what? To protect my own interests? To set boundaries? To refuse to be treated like an inconvenience in my own daughter's life? Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm that had been building all day was finally breaking, and I felt the metaphor wasn't lost on any of us. You're being dramatic, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction now. I don't treat you like an inconvenience. Don't you? When was the last time you called just to talk? When was the last time you asked about my life, my interests, my feelings? When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of a service provider? The questions hung in the air, unanswered because we all knew the answers. The rain was falling harder now, creating a curtain of water between us that felt appropriate somehow. I love you, Mom, Sarah said finally, her voice small. You know I love you. I know you say you love me, I replied. But love without respect isn't love, it's possession. And I'm not anyone's possession anymore. David grabbed Sarah's arm, his patience clearly exhausted. Come on, babe. We don't need this drama. Let her sit in her house alone and see how that works out for her. The threat was clear, and a month ago it would have terrified me. The prospect of losing Sarah completely, of being cut off from her life and any future grandchildren, would have sent me scrambling to apologize and accommodate. But standing in my doorway with my new locks and my reclaimed dignity, I felt something different. Not fear, but a strange kind of peace. That's your choice to make, I said to David, then looked directly at Sarah. Both of yours. But I won't be blackmailed into accepting disrespect. Not anymore. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I wavered. The instinct to comfort her, to smooth things over, to make myself smaller so she could feel better was almost overwhelming. But I held my ground. I love you, Sarah, I said. I will always love you. But I love myself too, and I'm finally learning what that means. They left without another word, David pulling Sarah toward their car as the rain soaked through their expensive clothes. I watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing into the storm, and felt something shift inside me like tectonic plates finding a new alignment. I closed the door and turned the new lock, the sound crisp and final in the sudden quiet. The house felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. Like a sanctuary that had been reclaimed from invaders who hadn't even realized they were trespassing. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the storm rage outside while feeling perfectly calm within. The rain washed the world clean, and I felt washed clean too, purged of the need to earn love through submission, freed from the exhausting work of making myself acceptable to people who had forgotten how to value me. Respect is not a loan to be repaid, I thought, watching lightning illuminate the sky. It's a basic requirement for any relationship worth having. The storm would pass, as storms always do. And in the morning, I would wake up in a house that belonged entirely to me, with keys that opened only to my touch, and a life that was finally, completely my own. The knock came soft and tentative, so different from the angry pounding of the night before that I almost didn't hear it over the gentle patter of morning rain. I looked through the peephole and saw Mrs. Chen from next door, holding a covered plate and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she'd witnessed last night's drama and had come to offer comfort. I opened the door, all the way this time, no chain lock needed for this visitor. I brought you some bread, she said in her careful English, holding up the plate. Fresh from the oven. And maybe we could have tea? Mrs. Chen was 83, a widow who had lived next door for as long as I could remember. We'd exchanged pleasantries over the fence for years, shared concerns about package deliveries and storm damage, but we'd never really talked. Not the way women talk when they recognize something familiar in each other's eyes. "I'd like that very much," I said, stepping aside to let her in. She settled into my kitchen like she belonged there, her small hands busy with the ritual of tea preparation while I arranged her bread on a proper plate. The loaves were golden and fragrant, still warm from the oven, and the smell filled my kitchen with the kind of comfort that comes from simple, generous acts. "I heard the shouting last night," she said without preamble, her dark eyes kind but direct. "Sounded familiar." I poured hot water over the tea leaves and waited for her to continue. "My daughter lives in Seattle now, Mrs. Chen said, accepting the cup I offered. "She calls once a month, always in a hurry. Always has advice about what I should do, where I should live, and how I should spend my money. Never asks what I want." The parallel was so clear it took my breath away. Here was another woman, another mother, navigating the same treacherous waters of adult children who confused love with control. "What do you do?" I asked. Mrs. Chen smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "I live my life. I bake bread. I tend my garden. I read books she thinks are too difficult for someone my age. I travel when I want to travel. I say no when I want to say no." And she accepts that? She had to learn to accept it. Just like your daughter will have to learn. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, breaking bread and sipping tea while the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows. The bread was perfect, crusty outside, soft within, with the kind of complex flavor that comes from patience and skill. "This is wonderful," I said, savoring another bite. "My grandmother's recipe, Mrs. Chen said. She taught me that bread is like dignity, it rises best when you don't rush it, and it feeds more than just the body." The wisdom in her words settled over me like a warm blanket. Here was a woman who had learned what I was still learning, that survival sometimes looks like shared bread and quiet defiance. That dignity doesn't require an audience, only commitment. "I changed my locks yesterday," I said, surprising myself with the admission. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Good. Sometimes we have to lock out the old patterns before we can let in the new possibilities." "I'm scared," I confessed. "What if I lose her completely? What if this is the end of our relationship?" Mrs. Chen reached across the table and patted my hand with her small, strong fingers. "Child, you can't lose what you never really had. A relationship built on your diminishment isn't a relationship, it's a performance. And you're too old to keep performing for people who don't appreciate the show." Her words hit me like a gentle slap, waking me up to truths I'd been avoiding. She was right. I had been performing for Sarah for years, the role of the accommodating mother, the grateful grandmother-in-waiting, the woman who was thankful for whatever scraps of attention she received. "How do you bear it?" I asked. "The loneliness? The uncertainty?" Mrs. Chen's smile was gentle but firm. "Loneliness is not the same as being alone. I am alone by choice now, not by abandonment. There's dignity in that difference." She stood and moved to my window, looking out at her garden where late-season flowers still bloomed despite the rain. "You see my marigolds there? They bloom until the first frost, no matter what the weather brings. They don't ask permission from the rain or apologize to the wind. They just bloom because that's what they're meant to do." I joined her at the window, watching the bright orange flowers nod in the gentle storm. They looked defiant and beautiful, refusing to be diminished by the gray day. "Sometimes survival is shared bread," Mrs. Chen said, gathering her empty plate. "Sometimes it's knowing when to bloom despite the weather. And sometimes it's just having the courage to lock your own door." After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about marigolds and dignity and the difference between loneliness and solitude. The bread she'd brought sat on my counter like a gift, like proof that kindness could come from unexpected places when you finally stopped begging for it from people who had forgotten how to give it. I made a list of things I wanted to do, not things I should do or things that would please other people, but things that would feed my own soul. Travel to places I'd always wanted to see. Take classes I'd always been too busy for. Volunteer for causes I care about. Simple things, but revolutionary in their focus on my own desires rather than everyone else's expectations. The afternoon brought another phone call from Sarah, but I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready yet, and that was okay. Readiness couldn't be rushed any more than bread could be hurried in its rising. Instead, I spent the day rearranging my living room, moving furniture to create better light for reading, hanging pictures I'd kept in storage because Sarah had once said they were too old-fashioned. The house began to feel more like mine and less like a museum of who I used to be. By evening, the rain had stopped, and the air smelled clean and full of possibilities. I made dinner for one and ate it slowly, savoring each bite without apologizing to anyone for my choices. I read a book Sarah would have found boring, listened to music she would have called outdated, and went to bed early because I wanted to, not because I had nothing else to do. For the first time in months, I slept deeply and dreamlessly, like a woman who had finally come home to herself. The travel agency smelled like possibility and adventure, with posters of distant places covering every wall. I sat across from Jennifer, a young woman with kind eyes and an infectious enthusiasm for helping people discover the world beyond their comfort zones. "So you're thinking of a solo trip?" she asked, her fingers poised over her keyboard. "Yes," I said, the word feeling bold and strange in my mouth. "Somewhere I've never been. Somewhere that's just for me." Jennifer's smile was encouraging. "That's wonderful. Solo travel can be incredibly empowering, especially for women who are starting new chapters in their lives." A new chapter. Yes, that's exactly what this was. The old chapter, the one where I made myself small to fit into other people's stories, was ending. This new chapter would be written entirely by me, for me. "I've always wanted to see Ireland," I said. "The countryside, the small villages, the history." "Ireland is perfect for solo travelers," Jennifer said, pulling up images on her computer screen. "Friendly people, beautiful landscapes, rich culture." "When were you thinking of going?" "Soon," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "As soon as possible." We spent an hour planning an itinerary that made my heart race with excitement. A small cottage in County Cork for a week, then a few days in Dublin to see the museums and galleries. Train rides through green countryside, walks along dramatic coastlines, evenings in cozy pubs listening to traditional music. "This looks perfect," I said, reviewing the printed itinerary. "I'll take it." Jennifer beamed as she processed my deposit. "You're going to have an amazing time. There's something magical about traveling alone. You discover parts of yourself you never knew existed." I walked out of the agency with my confirmation papers and a lightness in my step I hadn't felt in years. The October air was crisp and bright, full of the promise of change. I had a passport that hadn't been used in a decade, a suitcase that had been gathering dust in my closet, and 3 weeks until departure. 3 weeks to prepare for the most selfish, wonderful thing I'd done in years. At home, I pulled my old suitcase from the closet and set it on my bed. It was navy blue with brass corners, a gift from my ex-husband for our 10th anniversary. We'd planned to travel together, to see the world beyond our small corner of it. But life had gotten in the way, work, children, responsibilities that seemed more important than dreams. Now, finally, I was going to use it for its intended purpose. I began making lists of what to pack, what to research, and what to arrange before leaving. The practical details of solo travel felt like small acts of rebellion. Booking a single room. Making reservations for one. Planning an itinerary that pleased no one but myself. My phone rang while I was researching Irish weather patterns. Sarah's name on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail again. I wasn't avoiding her forever, but I wasn't ready to defend my choices or explain my decisions. Not yet. The voicemail she left was different from the angry messages of the past few days. Her voice was smaller, uncertain. Mom, I don't understand what's happening. Can we please talk? I miss you. The words tugged at my heart, but I didn't call back immediately. Missing someone and respecting them weren't the same thing, and I'd learned the difference too well to forget it now. Instead, I continued planning my trip. I researched the history of the places I'd visit, learned basic Irish phrases, and read travel blogs written by other solo female travelers. Each piece of information felt like armor, protecting me against the voice in my head that whispered I was too old, too inexperienced, too foolish to travel alone. That evening, I called Margaret to tell her about my plans. Ireland, she exclaimed. How wonderful. When do you leave? 3 weeks, I said. I'm terrified and excited in equal measure. That's exactly how you should feel when you're doing something important, Margaret said. Fear means you're growing. Excitement means you're alive. We talked for an hour about travel tips and must-see places, about the courage it takes to step outside your comfort zone and the rewards that wait on the other side. When I hung up, I felt supported and understood in a way I hadn't experienced in months. I spent the rest of the evening reading about Irish culture and history, making notes in a small journal I'd bought specifically for the trip. The act of writing in it felt significant, like documenting the beginning of something important. Freedom fits in one suitcase, I wrote on the first page. The words looked bold and true, like a manifesto for the woman I was becoming. Outside, the world continued its ancient rhythms. But inside my house, with my suitcase open and my passport ready, I felt like I was already traveling. Already discovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. Already learning that the most important journey isn't to a distant place, but back to yourself. The letter took me 3 days to write. I started it a dozen times, crumpling page after page as I struggled to find words that were honest without being cruel, clear without being harsh. The wastebasket beside my desk overflowed with false starts and abandoned attempts. Finally, on a gray Thursday morning with rain tapping against my study window, the words came. My dearest Sarah. *I am writing this letter not to send it, but to understand my own heart. To put into words the things I cannot seem to say when we're face to face, when emotion clouds clarity, and old patterns reassert themselves like muscle memory. *I want you to know that I love you. I have loved you since the moment I first held you, red-faced and furious at being born. I loved you through sleepless nights and scraped knees, through teenage rebellion and young adult uncertainty. I love you still, even now, even in the midst of this painful distance between us. But love, I have learned, is not the same as acceptance. Love does not require me to diminish myself so you can feel larger. Love does not mean saying yes when my heart screams no. Love does not mean accepting disrespect disguised as independence. For too long, I confused love with service. I thought being a good mother meant making myself available for your convenience, grateful for your attention, apologetic for my needs. I thought love meant never saying no, never setting boundaries, never asking for the basic respect I would demand from a stranger. I was wrong. You are a grown woman now, capable, strong, and independent. You don't need a mother who enables your worst impulses by accepting them without question. You need a mother who models self-respect, who shows you what it looks like to value yourself enough to demand better. I am learning to be that mother. It is harder than I expected and more necessary than I knew. I changed the locks not to keep you out, but to keep myself in. To create a space where I can remember who I am when I'm not trying to be who you want me to be. I updated my financial arrangements not to punish you, but to protect myself from being treated like a resource rather than a person. These are not acts of anger, though I know they may feel that way to you. They are acts of love, love for myself, and ultimately, love for you. Because the woman who raised you deserves better than to be tolerated. And the woman you're becoming deserves to learn that love without respect is not love at all. I am going to Ireland next week. Alone. Not because I'm running away from you, but because I'm running toward myself. I want to see what it feels like to make choices based on my own desires rather than other people's expectations. I want to remember what it's like to be curious about the world instead of just grateful for whatever small piece of it I'm allowed to occupy. When I return, I hope we can talk. Really talk, not just exchange accusations and defenses. I hope you can see that my boundaries are not walls meant to keep you out, but foundations meant to hold us both up. I hope you can learn to love me the way I am learning to love myself, completely, without conditions, without the need to make me smaller so you can feel bigger. Until then, I will carry you in my heart as I always have. But I will no longer carry the weight of your disappointment in who I am. That burden is too heavy, and I am too old to keep lifting it. With all my love and hope for our future. Mom. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words I'd fought so hard to find. It said everything I needed to say and nothing I was ready to share. Some truths, I realized, are for paper only. Some conversations happen in the space between what we write and what we send, in the silence between what we feel and what we say. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer next to my travel documents and the lists I'd made. It would stay there, unread by anyone but me, serving its purpose simply by existing. Sometimes the act of writing is more important than the act of sending. Sometimes clarity comes not from being understood by others, but from understanding yourself. The candle on my desk flickered in the draft from the window, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion, washing the world clean for whatever came next. I blew out the candle and closed my desk drawer, sealing away words that had served their purpose simply by being written. Tomorrow, I will finish packing for Ireland. Tonight, I would sit with the peace that comes from finally knowing your own mind. Some truths are for paper only. But once written, they become part of you in a way that can never be erased. They become the foundation upon which you build whatever comes next. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline light that makes everything look like it's been washed in possibility. I stood in my bedroom, looking at the navy dress I'd chosen, elegant but not attention-seeking, appropriate but not apologetic. The dress of a woman who knew her place and intended to claim it. My suitcase sat by the door, packed and ready for my flight to Ireland the next morning. The timing wasn't coincidental. I would attend my daughter's wedding, bear witness to her joy, and then begin my own journey toward whatever came next. I arrived at the church early, before the crowds and chaos, when the morning light still slanted through stained glass windows and painted rainbow patterns on empty pews. The marigold garlands hung heavy and fragrant, their orange petals bright against the cream-colored silk that draped every surface. I walked slowly down the aisle, my heels clicking against marble that reflected my image like a mirror. The front row waited, draped in silk with small bouquets tied to each chair back. My place. The place I had earned through 37 hours of labor, through midnight fevers and scraped knees, through homework help and heartbreak comfort, through 1,000 small acts of love that had shaped the woman who would soon walk down this aisle in white. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, feeling the weight of my decision settle around me like armor. Other guests began to arrive, filling the pews behind me with whispered conversations and rustling programs. I heard my name mentioned, saw heads turn in my direction, felt the curious energy of people who had heard about the family drama, and wondered how it would play out. Let them wonder. I was done performing for audiences who didn't understand the show. The organ began its gentle prelude, and the energy in the church shifted from anticipation to reverence. Bridesmaids began their procession, young women in dusty rose gowns who smiled nervously as they walked. Sarah's friends, most of whom I'd known since they were children, most of whom avoided my eyes as they passed. Then the music swelled, and everyone rose to their feet. The bride's entrance, the moment every wedding builds toward, the culmination of months of planning and dreaming and hoping. Sarah appeared at the back of the church, radiant in ivory silk and ancestral lace, her veil cascading behind her like water. She was beautiful, breathtakingly, heartbreakingly beautiful. For a moment, I forgot everything else and simply marveled at this woman I had raised, this person who had grown from the baby I'd held to the bride who now commanded every eye in the room. She began her walk down the aisle, her steps measured and graceful, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. As she drew closer, our eyes met across the space that separated us, physical and emotional, temporary and perhaps permanent. "Don't sit here," she had said that morning, her voice sharp with rejection. "You don't deserve a seat at my wedding." But I was sitting here. In the front row, where mothers belong, where I had earned my place through love and sacrifice and the simple fact of having brought this woman into the world. I was sitting here not because I had permission, but because I belonged here. Sarah's steps faltered slightly as she passed my pew. Her eyes widened with something that might have been surprise or anger or perhaps, underneath it all, relief. Relief that her mother had refused to disappear, had refused to accept exile from the most important day of her daughter's life. I smiled at her, not a challenging smile or a triumphant one, but the smile of a mother watching her child take an important step. A smile that said, "I am here because I love you, not because you invited me. I am here because this is where I belong, not because you gave me permission." She continued down the aisle, her composure regained, her focus shifting to the man waiting for her at the altar. But I had seen the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the moment when she understood that her mother was not going to be erased from this day or any other. The ceremony proceeded with traditional beauty, vows spoken with trembling voices, rings exchanged with steady hands, promises made in the presence of God and family and friends. I listened to every word, witnessed every gesture, claimed my place as mother of the bride not through invitation but through presence. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, when David lifted Sarah's veil and kissed her with gentle reverence, when the congregation erupted in applause and joy, I clapped along with everyone else. Not because I approved of how I'd been treated, but because I loved my daughter enough to celebrate her happiness even in the midst of our estrangement. As the newly married couple processed back down the aisle, Sarah's eyes found mine again. This time, there was something different in her expression, not anger or surprise, but a kind of grudging respect. The recognition that her mother had drawn a line and held it had claimed her dignity and refused to surrender it. I remained seated as the church emptied around me, as guests filed out to throw rice and take pictures and begin the celebration that would continue without me. I sat in the sudden quiet, surrounded by the lingering scent of marigolds and the echo of promises made and witnessed. Presence itself can be a protest, I thought, looking at the altar where my daughter had just pledged her life to another person. Sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. I gathered my purse and stood slowly, my legs stiff from sitting, but my spine straight with purpose. Tomorrow I would fly to Ireland, and I would begin the journey toward whatever version of myself was waiting on the other side of this painful transformation. Tonight, I would pack the last of my things and prepare for a future that belonged entirely to me. But first, I would go home and make tea. I would sit in my kitchen with my new keys on the counter and my suitcase by the door, and I would feel what it was like to have claimed my place without asking permission. The late afternoon sun slanted through the church windows as I walked back down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the space. At the door, I turned for one last look at the altar where my daughter had just begun her new life. The marigold still hung bright and defiant, refusing to wilt despite the weight of the day. Like me, I thought. Still blooming despite the weather. The cottage in County Cork sat like a jewel in the green Irish countryside, its stone walls weathered by centuries of Atlantic storms and its windows bright with morning light. I stood in the doorway with my single suitcase, breathing air that tasted of salt and possibility, feeling like I had traveled not just across an ocean but across decades of accumulated compromise. The past week had been a revelation. I had walked the cliffs of Moher alone, feeling the wind whip my hair and the spray of ancient seas on my face. I had sat in Dublin pubs listening to traditional music, nursing a single pint of Guinness, and feeling perfectly content in my own company. I had wandered through the Book of Kells exhibition, marveling at illuminated manuscripts created by monks who understood that beauty was worth preserving even in the darkest of times. Each day had been mine to shape, each decision mine to make. Where to eat, what to see, when to rest, how to spend the precious hours of freedom I had given myself. No one to accommodate, no one to please, no one to apologize to for my choices. The cottage came with a small garden where late-season roses still bloomed despite the October chill. I made tea each morning and carried it outside, sitting on a wooden bench that faced the rolling hills and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with my own company. On my last morning, I wrote postcards I would never send. One to Sarah, telling her about the beauty I'd witnessed and a peace I'd found. One to Margaret, thanking her for the friendship that had helped me find my courage. One to Mrs. Chen, describing the bread I'd bought from a village bakery that reminded me of hers. The act of writing without sending had become a meditation, a way of processing thoughts and feelings without the burden of managing other people's reactions. Some communications, I had learned, were complete in themselves. Some truths needed only to be acknowledged, not shared. My phone had remained mostly silent during the trip. A few texts from Margaret checking on my safety, a message from the bank confirming a transaction, and one missed call from Sarah that I hadn't returned. The silence felt like freedom rather than isolation, like space to breathe rather than emptiness to fill. On the flight home, I sat by the window watching clouds drift past like thoughts I was finally ready to release. The woman who had left for Ireland a week ago felt like a stranger now, smaller, more apologetic, more willing to accept crumbs and call them a feast. The woman returning was someone I was still getting to know, but I liked her already. She took up space without apologizing for it. She made decisions based on her own desires rather than other people's expectations. She understood that love without respect was not love at all, and she was no longer willing to accept substitutes. The plane touched down in the gray afternoon of an American autumn, and I felt ready to face whatever waited for me. Not eager, perhaps, but ready. There's a difference, and it matters more than you might think. Home felt different when I returned, though nothing had changed in my absence. The new lock still gleamed, the empty bedroom still echoed with possibility, the kitchen still smelled faintly of the tea I'd made before leaving. But I moved through the familiar spaces with a different energy, the confidence of a woman who had proven to herself that she could be happy in her own company. I unpacked slowly, savoring the ritual of returning. Irish wool sweaters that smelled of peat fires and sea air. A small stone from the cliffs of Moher that I placed on my windowsill like a talisman. A journal filled with observations and sketches, and the gradual documentation of a woman remembering who she was. The answering machine blinked with messages I wasn't ready to hear. Bills that needed paying, appointments that needed scheduling, the ordinary business of a life that had continued in my absence. But first, I made tea and sat in my kitchen, feeling the profound satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged. The knock came as the sun was setting, painting my kitchen walls gold and orange. Soft and tentative, like someone who wasn't sure of their welcome. I looked through the peephole and saw Sarah standing on my doorstep, her face pale and uncertain, her hands empty of the righteous anger that had characterized our last encounter. I opened the door, all the way, no chain lock needed. We looked at each other across the threshold, mother and daughter separated by weeks of silence and years of accumulated hurt. "I got your postcard," she said finally. I frowned, confused. "I didn't send any postcards." "I know. But I got one anyway. From the hotel. They said you'd listed me as an emergency contact and wanted to make sure I knew you'd arrived safely." The small kindness of strangers, I thought. The way the world sometimes conspires to heal what we've broken. "May I come in?" Sarah asked. I stepped aside, and she entered my kitchen like she was visiting a foreign country. She looked around at the space that had been hers to enter freely for 34 years, now requiring invitation and permission. "You went to Ireland," she said. "I did." "Alone?" "Yes." She sat at my kitchen table without being invited, a small presumption that felt like progress. "I've been thinking about what you said. About respect. About boundaries. About she paused, struggling with words. About the way I've been treating you. I poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from her, waiting. I didn't realize, she continued, her voice small. I thought I was just being independent. I thought I was just busy with wedding planning, work, and life. I didn't realize I was being cruel. The admission hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we could cross. I missed you, she said. At the reception. I kept looking for you, expecting you to be there. When you weren't, I realized how much I'd been taking you for granted. How much I'd been assuming you'd always be there no matter how I treated you. I was there, I said quietly. At the ceremony. In the front row. Her eyes filled with tears. I know. I saw you. I was so angry at first, but then I was glad. Glad that you didn't let me push you away completely. Glad that you claimed your place even when I tried to take it from you. We sat in silence for a moment, sipping tea and feeling our way towards something that might eventually become forgiveness. I don't know how to fix this, Sarah said finally. I don't know how to undo the damage I've done. You don't undo it, I said. You acknowledge it, and you do better going forward. You learn that love isn't about control, and respect isn't optional. Can you teach me? She asked, her voice breaking slightly. Can you show me how to love you better? The question pierced my heart with its vulnerability, its recognition that love was a skill that could be learned and improved. Those relationships could be rebuilt on stronger foundations if both people were willing to do the work. We can learn together, I said. But it has to be different this time. I won't go back to accepting disrespect disguised as independence. I won't go back to making myself smaller so you can feel bigger. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I don't want you to be smaller. I want you to be exactly who you are. I want to know who you are when you're not trying to please me. That might take some time, I said. I'm still figuring that out myself. I have time, she said. If you'll let me. I reached across the table and took her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of my child's fingers in mine. But this time, the gesture felt different. Not the desperate clinging of a mother afraid of losing her daughter, but the steady clasp of 2 women choosing to rebuild something that had been broken. We'll start slowly, I said. With respect. With boundaries. With the understanding that love doesn't mean unlimited access to each other's lives. Okay, she said. Whatever you need. What I need, I said, is a daughter who treats me like a person worth knowing, not just a service provider to be managed. What I need is a relationship built on mutual respect, not just obligation. You have that, she said. You've always had that. I just forgot how to show it. We talked until the sun set completely, until my kitchen was lit only by the warm glow of the overhead light and a candle I'd lit on the table. We talked about boundaries and expectations, about the difference between love and control, about the work it would take to rebuild trust that had been damaged by months of accumulated slights. It wasn't a magical reconciliation. There were no dramatic apologies or tearful embraces. Just 2 women sitting at a kitchen table, drinking tea and feeling their way toward a new understanding of what it meant to love each other well. When Sarah finally left, she hugged me at the door, a real hug, not the perfunctory embrace of obligation but the genuine affection of someone who had remembered how to value what she'd almost lost. Thank you, she said. For not giving up on us. For sitting in the front row, even when I told you not to. For showing me what it looks like to respect yourself. After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, feeling the profound satisfaction of a conversation that had changed something fundamental between us. Not fixed everything, that would take time and consistent effort from both of us. But changed the trajectory, shifted the foundation, created space for something better to grow. I made 1 more cup of tea and carried it to my living room, where I sat in my favorite chair and looked out at the night sky. The stars were bright and clear, unmarred by clouds, and I felt like I could see all the way to Ireland from my window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the boundaries I'd learned to set. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own house, with my own keys, living my own life on my own terms. The feeling was intoxicating and peaceful and necessary. Like learning to breathe underwater, or discovering you could fly. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making bread, the ancient rhythm of kneading dough as meditative as prayer. The morning light streamed through windows I'd had cleaned professionally, illuminating a space that had become truly mine in ways I was still discovering. Sarah came for Sunday dinner now, but not every Sunday. Sometimes she was busy with her new marriage, sometimes I was busy with my own plans. The difference was that we both understood these absences weren't rejections but simply the natural ebb and flow of two independent lives that chose to intersect regularly. She helped me set the table, moving around my kitchen with the careful respect of someone who understood she was a guest in a space that belonged entirely to someone else. It was a small shift, but it changed everything. She asked before opening my refrigerator, knocked before entering when the door was closed, and called before coming over instead of simply appearing. "The bread smells amazing," she said, arranging napkins beside the plates. "Is this the recipe Mrs. Chen taught you?" "A variation of it," I said, checking the loaves in the oven. "I've been experimenting." Experimenting. The word felt revolutionary applied to my own life. For too long, I had followed other people's recipes, for motherhood, for relationships, for what it meant to be a woman of my age. Now I was learning to improvise, to trust my own instincts, to create something uniquely mine. The bread was perfect when I pulled it from the oven, golden and fragrant, with the kind of complex flavor that comes from patience and practice. I set the loaves on cooling racks and felt the deep satisfaction of having created something beautiful with my own hands. "I have news," Sarah said as we sat down to eat. "David and I are thinking about starting a family." The announcement should have filled me with joy, and part of it did. But I also felt something else, a careful distance, a protective boundary that hadn't existed before. I loved my daughter, but I would not lose myself in the role of grandmother the way I had lost myself in the role of mother. "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it. "When you're ready, you'll make good parents." "I was hoping," Sarah said carefully, "that you might want to be involved. Not in the way my mother-in-law wants to be involved, she's already planning the nursery and buying clothes. But in your own way. Whatever that looks like for you." The invitation was genuine, but it came with an understanding that hadn't existed before. She was asking, not assuming. Offering, not demanding. Recognizing that my involvement would be on my terms, not hers. "I'd like that," I said. "When the time comes, we'll figure out what that looks like together." We ate in comfortable silence for a while, the bread warm and satisfying between us. Outside, spring was asserting itself with the kind of determined beauty that comes after a long winter. My garden was beginning to show signs of life, bulbs I'd planted in the fall pushing through soil that had seemed frozen forever. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah said eventually. "About love and respect. About the difference between the two. And I think I'm finally starting to understand. Love is what I feel for you, it's constant and unconditional and sometimes overwhelming. But respect is what I do with that love. It's how I treat you, how I speak to you, how I make space for you to be yourself instead of who I need you to be." The distinction was so clear, so perfectly articulated, that I felt tears prick my eyes. This was what I had been trying to teach her, what I had been trying to learn myself. That love without respect was possession, not relationship. That caring for someone meant honoring their autonomy, not controlling their choices. "Yes," I said simply. "That's exactly right." After dinner, we cleaned up together, moving around my kitchen with the easy choreography of two people who had learned to work together without stepping on each other's toes. Sarah washed while I dried, and we talked about small things, her work, my garden, the book club I'd joined, the cooking class she was taking. Ordinary conversation between two women who happened to be related, but who had learned to see each other as individuals first, mother and daughter second. When she left, Sarah hugged me goodbye with genuine affection. Thank you for dinner. And for everything else. For teaching me how to love you better. Thank you for learning, I said. For being willing to do the work. After she left, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and the profound satisfaction of a relationship that had been rebuilt on stronger foundations. Not perfect, no relationship ever is. But honest. Respectful. Built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual regard rather than assumed entitlement. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, sitting in this same chair, but feeling like a stranger in her own life. That woman had been so afraid of losing her daughter that she had lost herself instead. She had confused love with service, respect with submission, peace with surrender. This woman, the one I was becoming, understood the difference. She knew that sitting down was not asking permission, that presence itself could be a protest, that dignity didn't require anyone else's approval. I made a final list, not of things I no longer owed but of things I now carried. Things I now carry. The knowledge that I am enough, exactly as I am. The understanding that love multiplies when it's given freely, not demanded. The peace that comes from living authentically. The joy of relationships built on choice rather than obligation. The strength that comes from setting boundaries and holding them. The wisdom that some battles are won by simply refusing to fight them. The certainty that I deserve respect, not because I've earned it, but because I exist. I folded the paper and put it in my desk drawer next to the letter I'd never sent and the travel documents from Ireland. Evidence of a journey that had taken me not just across an ocean, but across the vast distance between who I had been and who I was becoming. Outside, the world continued its ancient rhythms. But inside my house, with my bread cooling on the counter and my tea warm in my hands, I felt the profound satisfaction of a woman who had finally learned to be at home in her own life. The rain began to fall gently against my windows, washing the world clean for whatever came next. I sat in my chair, listening to the familiar percussion of water against glass, feeling perfectly content in my own company. Some storms, I had learned, were meant to wash things clean. Some endings were really beginnings in disguise. Some acts of love looked like letting go, and some acts of strength looked like sitting down and refusing to move. I had claimed my place at my daughter's wedding not because I had permission, but because I belonged there. I had rebuilt our relationship not by accepting the unacceptable, but by demanding better. I had found my way back to myself not by becoming someone new, but by remembering who I had always been underneath all the compromises. The bread finished cooling as the evening settled around my house like a comfortable blanket. I wrapped one loaf in clean linen and set it aside for Mrs. Chen, who had become not just a neighbor but a friend, a fellow traveler on the path of learning to live authentically in the later chapters of life. The other loaf I sliced carefully, the knife moving through the golden crust with the satisfying resistance of something well-made. I spread a piece with butter and honey, tasting the complex flavors that came from patience and practice, from ingredients given time to become something greater than their individual parts. Like relationships, I thought. Like the slow work of rebuilding trust and respect. Like the gradual process of learning to love yourself enough to demand better from the world. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. How did dinner go? I typed back, better than I hoped. We're learning. 3 dots appeared, then, proud of you. Coffee tomorrow? Yes, I replied. My treat. The simple exchange filled me with warmth. Here was friendship without conditions, support without strings attached, love that didn't require me to diminish myself to receive it. I had learned to recognize the difference, and it made all the difference. I carried my tea and bread to the living room, settling into my chair by the window where I could watch the rain paint patterns on the glass. The house felt peaceful around me, not empty but full of possibility, full of choices that belonged entirely to me, full of the quiet satisfaction that comes from living authentically. On the table beside my chair sat the small stone I'd brought back from Ireland, smooth and grey and worn by centuries of Atlantic storms. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my palm, remembering the moment I'd found it on the beach below the cliffs of Moher. I had been walking alone, feeling the wind whip my hair and the spray of ancient seas on my face, when I'd seen it nestled among the pebbles like a gift waiting to be discovered. It had seemed significant then, this small piece of a distant shore that had somehow found its way to me. Now I understand why. It was proof that beautiful things could survive the storm, that what seemed solid and unchanging could be shaped by time and pressure into something even more beautiful. Like me. Like the woman I was becoming. Like the relationship I was rebuilding with my daughter, one careful conversation at a time. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and I felt myself settling deeper into the peace that had become my natural state. Not the fragile peace of someone avoiding conflict, but the deep peace of someone who had learned to stand in her own truth without apology. I thought about the wedding, about the moment when I had sat in that front row despite being told I didn't deserve to be there. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than a year. The woman who had made that choice felt both familiar and foreign to me now, familiar because she was me, foreign because she had been braver than I'd known I could be. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps courage wasn't about feeling brave but about acting with dignity even when your hands were shaking. Perhaps strength wasn't about never being afraid but about refusing to let fear make your choices for you. I finished my bread and tea as the rain began to ease, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the boundaries I'd learned to set, and new chances to choose respect over peace and authenticity over approval. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own house, with my own keys, living my own life on my own terms. The feeling was no longer intoxicating or terrifying. It had become simply natural, the way breathing becomes natural once you remember how to do it properly. I rose from my chair and moved through my house, turning off lights and checking locks, performing the small rituals of a woman settling in for the night. In my bedroom, I changed into comfortable clothes and brushed my teeth, looking at myself in the mirror with something approaching fondness. The woman looking back at me had silver hair and laugh lines, tired eyes, and a mouth that had learned to say no. She was 63 years old and finally growing up, finally learning that love without respect was not love at all, finally understanding that the most radical act was simply refusing to disappear. I liked her. More than that, I respected her. She had done the hard work of reclaiming her own life, of setting boundaries and holding them, of choosing dignity over peace and authenticity over approval. She had learned that sitting down was not asking permission, that presence itself could be a protest, and that some truths were worth defending even when the cost was high. As I settled into bed, I felt the profound satisfaction of a day well lived, a choice well made, and a life finally aligned with its own values. The sheets were soft against my skin, the pillow perfectly positioned, and the room exactly the temperature I preferred. Small comforts, but they belonged entirely to me. Outside, the last of the rain tapped gently against my bedroom window, a lullaby that spoke of renewal and fresh starts. I closed my eyes and felt myself drifting toward sleep, carried by the deep peace that comes from being at home in your own life. In the morning, I would wake up in a house that belonged entirely to me. I would make coffee exactly the way I liked it, read the newspaper without apologizing for my choice of sections, and plan my day according to my own desires and priorities. I would live another day as a woman who had learned to value herself enough to demand better from the world. But for now, I slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had finally come home to herself after a very long journey. The sleep of a woman who had learned that dignity doesn't require permission, that love without respect is not love at all, and that sometimes the most important revolution happens quietly, one boundary at a time. The rain stopped completely as I drifted off, leaving the world clean and ready for whatever came next. And in my dreams, I was sitting in the front row of my own life, exactly where I belonged, exactly where I had always deserved to be.